The USS Arizona Memorial is now part of a larger national monument. The World War II Valor in the Pacific National Monument encompasses different sites of the Pacific Theater, beginning with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The monument also includes two other memorials located on Ford Island, both for ships lost here during the attack. The USS Oklahoma and USS Utah memorials commemorate the loss of almost 500 sailors and Marines. In a few moments, you'll see a film that explains why Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, with actual footage of the attack. This film is about nations and conflict, a broad overview of this monumental war. But war is not just about what happens to nations and their leaders. It's also about the millions of individuals from all over the world, from all walks of life, whose lives were caught up by forces beyond their control. It's the story of life and death, heroism and sacrifice. Today at the USS Arizona Memorial, you'll come face to face with the names of some of these individuals. For the men of the Arizona, the story is a tragic one, as the bomb that destroyed the Arizona ended their lives even before they knew what was happening. There really is no wartime story to tell about these men. Many others, civilian and military, lived through the attack, and for the next 3.5 years endured incredible hardship and extreme horror. Please consider this during your visit today. The USS Arizona Memorial is just one of many memorials built to honor the dead and to remember the event. Memorials are places of learning and inspiration, reflection, and quiet contemplation. This film will undoubtedly answer many questions, but it will surely raise questions also. Hold on to your questions, and when you arrive at the memorial, a park ranger will be glad to answer them. Now, as the lights dim, you're going to take a journey to the past, back to December 7th, 1941.
Out in the waters of Pearl Harbor, a striking white monument seems to ride at anchor. It is a memorial to a fallen crew, to a sunken ship. A symbol of a day that was burned into the American memory. The day was December 7th, 1941. The day of Japan's surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet here at Pearl Harbor. The day of our entry into World War II. The memorial stands over the sunken hulk of the battleship Arizona. Many of the men who died aboard the Arizona that morning still lie below her decks. The ship on which they served is now their tomb. The memorial, a shrine to their memory. What happened here on that Sunday in December? Why was our fleet attacked? Why were so many killed? The road to war between the United States and Japan began long before Pearl Harbor.
From the Japanese advance, which is sweeping over great provinces of northern China.
In 1931, Japanese army extremists seized China's northern province of Manchuria. And in 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China. War began in Europe 2 years later. Japan watched as Nazi armies occupied the Netherlands and France. Soon Britain was under siege. Far away in Southeast Asia, those European powers had colonies rich in natural resources. Now their colonies were ripe for conquest by Japan, the Nazis' ally. But the United States had interests in Asia too.
American lives are endangered as the invaders are about to storm in.
We were outraged by Japan's aggression in China.
Victims of the calamity of war.
We couldn't allow Japan to dominate the Pacific. To deter Japanese aggression, the United States moved her Pacific Fleet out to its base at Pearl Harbor in the Hawaiian Islands.
West Virginia steams from New York Harbor to join the rest of the fleet, ordered to the Pacific.
The backbone of our fleet had always been our battleships, armored giants named for the states of the Union.
To stand on duty in the Pacific, the fleet of the United States.
The USS Arizona was one of them. She was launched in 1915, modernized in 1930, ready to cruise and fight in the vast Pacific. She was a small city gone to sea. More than 1,500 men served aboard her. Officers, seamen, cooks, carpenters, gunners, Marines, and airmen.
All hands, man your battle station.
She was protected by more than 8,000 tons of armor plating.
The Admiral on his flagship as he leads his squadron into action. The mythical battle ordered by the signal.
Her 14-inch guns could fire a shell 20 miles. In war games and exercises, she looked invincible. But the Navy was soon to learn that the age of the battleship was at an end. The age of the aircraft carrier had arrived. One man who knew it was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet. Though opposed to war with the United States, Yamamoto believed that if Japan wanted to seize the European colonies in Southeast Asia, the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor would have to be knocked out first. He proposed to use Japan's first-line aircraft carriers and hundreds of planes in a massive surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Before the Americans could rebuild their fleet, Japan could achieve her goals in Asia. It was a daring gamble. In July 1941, Japanese forces seized all of French Indochina. Fearing that Japan would use these Indochina bases for an attack on our garrisons in the Philippines, the United States government took action. President Franklin Roosevelt demanded an end to Japanese aggression. To back up his demands, he stopped all sales of American oil to Japan. Oil, the lifeblood of the Japanese war machine. Committed to the conquest of Asia, Japan could not meet American demands without great humiliation. The hardline military leaders had forced Japan into a position from which there was no exit but war. In October, a war leader, General Hideki Tojo, took over as Prime Minister.
Toronto, New York, en route to Washington. In a dramatic attempt to avert war in the Pacific, Saburo Kurosu comes as the special envoy of the Tokyo government.
Even as fruitless negotiations to lift the oil embargo continued in Washington, the Imperial Navy prepared to carry out Yamamoto's plan. On November 26th, a Japanese task force comprising 6 aircraft carriers with heavy escort, commanded by Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, headed for Hawaii. They must cross 4,000 miles of open sea undetected. The American military knew that a surprise Japanese attack on Hawaii was possible, and they thought they were prepared. The U.S. Pacific Fleet was commanded by Admiral Husband E. Kimmel. Admiral Kimmel sent out the fleet from Honolulu weekly on exercises, preparing for offensive operations in case of war with Japan. While in port, the defense of the fleet rested with the Army under the command of Lieutenant General Walter C. Short. An impressive array of coast artillery, anti-aircraft guns, and even an early form of radar protected Oahu's shores. Army fighters based at Wheeler and outlying airfields guarded the skies. Hickam Field's heavy bombers could strike an enemy fleet long before it could reach attack position. General Short believed, however, that the great danger was not air attack, but saboteurs. To make his aircraft easier to guard, he ordered them parked wingtip to wingtip, their guns unloaded, in the center of the airfields. Saturday night, December 6, 1941. Most of the fleet was in port. That evening, there was a band concert in Block Arena. The carriers Enterprise and Lexington were away, delivering aircraft for the defense of Wake Island and Midway. The last night of peace slipped away. Six o'clock a.m., 220 miles north of Oahu. Still undetected, Nagumo turned his carriers into the wind and launched his planes. First, the fighters. Then the attack planes, carrying special armor-piercing bombs to hit the battleships, or aerial torpedoes modified to run in the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor. Last, the dive bombers. 183 planes in all. 30 minutes later, a second wave of 167 planes followed. At 6:30 a.m., the destroyer Ward sighted a submarine in the restricted waters off Pearl Harbor. Ward opened fire. She sank one of the 5 two-man midget submarines that were part of the Japanese attack force. Ward radioed Naval Headquarters, "We have attacked, fired upon, and dropped depth charges upon a submarine operating in defensive sea area." Minutes later, the radar installation on the north coast detected a large flight of incoming planes. Its operators notified the information center at Fort Shafter. The officer on duty there assumed that the planes were our own B-17s, due in that day from California. The radar operators were told, "Don't worry about it." The radar had detected the Japanese strike force. At 7:48 a.m., they hit Kaneohe Bay Naval Air Station. At Ford Island Naval Air Station, dive bombers tore apart the seaplanes and their hangars. The radio operator banged out a desperate message. "Air raid Pearl Harbor, this is not drill." Then, their torpedo planes struck. The cruiser Helena was hit, and the concussion shook apart the old mine layer Oglala. She sank. On the north side of Ford Island, the cruiser Raleigh and the training ship Utah were hit. Utah capsized, taking 58 men with her. Other torpedo planes swung around the harbor entrance and attacked from the south. Their target, the great ships moored along Battleship Row. Within minutes, West Virginia, Oklahoma, and California were all hit and sinking. West Virginia settled on the shallow bottom. Hit by 2 torpedoes, California began to list and would have turned over, but was counterflooded in time. She too sank upright. But Oklahoma rolled over too quickly to be saved. Within minutes, hundreds of seamen were trapped inside. 429 men died with Oklahoma. Arizona, a few minutes after 8. An armor-piercing bomb went through her deck and ignited the forward ammunition magazine. Thousands of tons of ammunition exploded. No one who heard that sound would ever forget it. 1,177 men died in those moments. Caught off guard, men fought back from all around the harbor as best they could. Sailors, soldiers, and Marines showed courage and resourcefulness. Many decorations for valor were won that day. Anti-aircraft fire was soon spoiling the aim of the attacking planes. Navy guns claimed 5 of the 29 torpedo planes that attacked Battleship Row. Only 14 American pilots were able to rise and meet the attackers. They claimed 11 Japanese planes shot down. At about 8:50, the second wave of bombers struck. Hickam and Wheeler Fields were hit again. The second wave smashed the destroyers Cassin and Downs in Dry Dock Number 1. The destroyer Shaw's ammunition stores exploded. Sailors thrown off their ships by the force of the explosions swam through oil burning on the surface of the harbor. Rescue boats dragged them alive and dead from the inferno of flame and water. Thick smoke from the burning ships provided some cover from the Japanese planes. But through the smoke, the attackers saw a single American battleship on the move. It was Nevada, badly damaged, but bravely trying to make the open sea. Japanese bombers swarmed down in an effort to sink her and block the channel. When she could go no further, to prevent the great ship from blocking the channel, her commander ran her aground at Hospital Point. At about 10 o'clock, a little more than 2 hours after they had first appeared, the Japanese planes departed to the north. They had inflicted on the United States Navy the greatest disaster in its history. 21 vessels, including all 8 first-line battleships, were sunk or damaged. Some 170 planes, both Army and Navy, destroyed. And the dead, more than 2,400. Another 1,200 wounded. Sailors, airmen, Marines, soldiers, and civilians. The victory was bought for a small price. 29 Japanese planes shot down, 55 airmen killed. 9 of the 10 midget subcrewmen also died. One was captured to become America's first prisoner of war.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
The attack on Pearl Harbor did something the Japanese had not counted on. It united America, awakened her fighting spirit, mobilized her industrial might. At Pearl Harbor, a massive salvage and recovery operation got underway. Almost every ship the Japanese sank was eventually put back into service. But not Oklahoma, not Utah, and not Arizona, left where she lay, a memorial and tomb for the men within. The American aircraft carriers had escaped the Japanese attack. 7 months later, the carriers Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet sailed out from Pearl Harbor to ambush the Japanese fleet attempting to capture Midway Island. In the battle, American Navy dive bombers sank 4 of the Japanese carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor. The tide of war turned at Midway. For 3 more years, Americans fought their way back across the Pacific, taking from Japan the lands she had seized. Millions would die. Millions more, soldiers and civilians, would suffer and sacrifice before the war ended. Meanwhile, the men of the USS Arizona lay where they fell, in the passageways, in the engine rooms, and below decks. War and peace, victory and surrender went on above them. Every year on December 7th, special ceremonies of remembrance are held here at the Visitors Center. The dead are mourned, the heroes are remembered. People from all over the world honor young men they never knew, whose lives were cut short on December 7th, 1941. How shall we remember them, those who died? Mourn the dead. Remember the battle. Understand the tragedy. Honor the memory. Let our grief for the men of Arizona be for all those whose futures were taken from them on December 7th, 1941. Here, they will never be forgotten.
Folks, at this time, please look around, make sure you have all of your belongings with you, then proceed to the doors on your right-hand side.